Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. This is my very first podcast, and I'm really excited to tell you some really terrible things. So thank you. Thank you for joining me. Most people I know do not want to hear any of this. So I'm really grateful that you're taking the time to listen. I hope my voice doesn't annoy you as much as it annoys me. And if it doesn't annoy you, and you want to hear more about some horrifying historical information, please rate, review, and subscribe to let me know that you want me to continue down this very upsetting path. I'm more than happy to do it on my own, but it would be really nice to know I have some friends along the way. So thank you so much in advance for that. Today, we're going to explore the gruesome, mysterious death of poor Octavia Hatcher. She was a woman born in 1869 that died at the young age of 21 in Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after giving birth to a child that did not survive, who, according to legend, was buried alive. Those who already know her story and the way that it ends would agree that her death, as it's commonly described anyway, was gruesome, but not many would agree that it was particularly mysterious. However, I've done some deep digging into this story, and I've unearthed a lot of unanswered questions, and although there may be some question marks around the way she ultimately died, the most likely cause of death, and the deaths of many, many women just like her, especially of this time, was undeniably truly awful. I also want to note that if you research Octavia, you won't find much information about her life. You will, however, find a great deal of information about her husband. And this made me kind of sad. But apart from the typical historical reasons for this kind of thing, there's another reason why her husband tends to be centered when talking about her death. It's simply because there's a ton of information, documented information about this guy everywhere. He was a very wealthy man and a big character, apparently. He was very philanthropic, and we can actually get a more clear picture about why Octavia's burial story may have spread the way that it did, based on the legitimate documented information about this guy's life. So please don't consider my lack of information on Octavia herself is due to anything other than there just isn't that much information out there. But here's what we do know. As the legend goes, Octavia Hatcher was born Octavia Smith to Jacob and Pricey Smith in Kentucky on the 21st of May in 1869. Her father was a fairly successful dry goods merchant, so Octavia was born into higher society at that time, which would likely explain how she came to be wooed by a very, very successful man named James Hatcher, who would come to be known as Uncle Jim later in life. At the age of 30, he married 19-year-old Octavia on the 18th of December, 1889. His family was the most wealthy family, or at least one of the most wealthy families in Pike County at this time. He was born on September of 1859 and moved to Pike County early as a child with his father, Andrew Jackson Peary Hatcher, and mother Mary Catherine Lane Hatcher. James entered business when he was just 18 and opened a warehouse for merchandise, which he would ship using a steamer called Mountain Girl. That was considered one of the finest boats on the river, but ultimately was a financial failure. Unsuccessful boats aside, James didn't let this get him down. He went on to build a fortune from a variety of investments in businesses like timber and coal mining and gas. So suffice it to say, James and Octavia were doing quite well for themselves. But as we all know, no amount of money can save you from fate's twisted plans. James's success continued to expand into real estate. He was responsible for building the town's courthouse, and in 1931, he opened what he called the Hotel Hatcher on Main Street in Pikeville in the Big Sandy River region. The hotel lobby was full of antiques from pioneer days, like chain dogs, boot jacks, muskets, and like homemade boots, mixing stools, and iron kettles, and a pair of handmade silk stockings which belonged to his mother. And this is kind of creepy. On a far wall, there was a baby's linen dress with heavy ruffles and embroidery that would have been common at the time of his own child's death. The hotel also included on the back porch what he intended to be one day his very own safety coffin. This was a coffin that hopefully would prevent you from being buried alive. His was black, walnut on the outside, and white satin on the inside, and according to descriptions from hotel employees from the time, it had a self-opening mechanism inside. Some also said it had a bell attached, so it's kind of unclear exactly what kind of safety coffin it was. I found a funny article with an interview of him that said, quote, "There was a lady. She wanted to get in the coffin with me. 'No, ma'am,' says I, 'not on your sweet life. There's no one goin' run to heaven on my coattail. But you know what? I ain't ordered my burying clothes yet, and I'll tell you why. I don't want them to go out of style.'" It says he then leans back for a long, deep laugh. He was 80 when that article was written. He died of a short illness while living with his brother the year of that article, which was 1939. It's unclear to me just how commonly regular, not wealthy folks had these coffins constructed, but they weren't uncommon. Safety coffins included comfortable padding, feeding tubes, intricate bell and string mechanisms, and even escape hatches. You may have seen the film The Nun, where coffins had little bells attached to strings that led down to the coffins of deceased nuns or not deceased nuns. The priest in that movie has a very unfortunate accident with one of those. To be serious, I can only imagine a poor gravedigger standing over one of those bell graves on a windy day, wondering if there's a living person pulling the string or not, or if it's just the weather. Imagine listening to a whole graveyard from afar just jingling in the wind. People were very afraid of being buried alive at this time. The fear is called tapophobia, and novels like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein put into the zeitgeist questions about living, death, and reanimation. The cocktail recipe for a corpse reviver appears in literature as early as an issue for Punch from 1861. Calls for half a wine glass of brandy, half a wine glass of maraschino liqueur, and 2 dashes of Boker's bitters. I like that half a wine glass is a unit of measurement for cocktails in the 1800s. Anyway, mistakenly dead and reanimated family member stories were also fairly common at this time. For example, an aristocratic family in the mid-1700s, they're called the Mount Edgumbe family. They have a tale of a family member, Countess Emma, who woke up during her own grave robbing. According to family legend, she woke up confused and freaked out, as one would. The guy ran off, 'cause terror, and she walked all the way home in the middle of the night in her burial clothes, shocking the family upon her return. A commemorative path was built on the estate, referred to as Countess Path, that she supposedly walked back to the home in the dark. The details of her waking up in her grave have, believe it or not been substantiated, but it's true that she didn't actually die until 1807. This family story started in 1760. So something, no matter what, something wacky happened to that family that led them to commemorate one of Emma's walks. So who knows? Could have happened. Another example of live burial, specifically of someone who was buried alive not once, but twice, is one from the 17th century in England of a woman named Alice Blunden. Supposedly, she drank a large amount of poppy tea, which knocked her out into a stupor that was so deep that placing a mirror under her nose didn't show any breath at all. She was pronounced dead, buried, and 2 days later, children playing near her grave heard noises. She was dug up and found to be alive, but barely. And I know this sounds strange, but since she was so close to death when dug up, the family just left her there. It's unclear if they actually covered her back up with dirt or if she was just laying in a closed coffin. The next day, though, the coffin was opened again, and they found that she woke up again and scratched at her clothes, body, and face, trying to get out of the coffin. There are documents confirming this from 1675 with descriptions such as, and brace yourself, they found she had torn off a great part of her winding sheet, scratched herself first in several places, and ripped off her own mouth. It was all in gore blood. End quote. It was at this time that she was officially considered actually dead, It should also be noted that the historical accuracy of this account has been questioned, though, despite all the documents, as the Paris Register at the time has her burial listed as taking place in 1674, and that other document wasn't written until the following year. So, even still, there's a whole plaque dedicated to her in Holy Ghost Cemetery in Basingstoke, England, which reads, Mrs. Blunden, wife of William Blunden Malster, was buried alive in this cemetery in July 1674. Parliament fined the town for its negligence. This very well may have happened. But the undeniable reality was, folks didn't have as many foolproof ways of determining whether someone was actually dead as they do now. And they knew it. So how did they determine someone was really, completely, seriously dead? They had what were referred to as death tests that ranged from, this is awful, hooking eyelids and lips up to electrical wires and shocking someone into consciousness. They'd also pour boiling water on a person in hopes of reviving them. Surely a boiling kettle poured over your chest or feet would shock you into consciousness, right? No, sometimes it wouldn't. And by the late 1800s, they were so bad at determining if people were actually dead and not just like comatose. Waiting mortuaries were popularized, where the dead, or possibly dead, were laid out on zinc trays to rot or not. They would be observed, and like most things, the rich had their own private sections, whereas the common folk were placed together. And this brings us back to poor Octavia, who, unlike her husband, did not have a safety coffin. After the birth and very quick death of her first and only child in 1891, little baby Jacob Hatcher, she quickly fell ill, like gravely ill, and about 3 months later she fell into a coma and died on May 2nd. Doctors could not determine the exact reason for her death, and she was not placed in one of those waiting mortuaries. In fact, they didn't even waste time embalming her because of an unseasonably hot Kentucky May. I did some quick research to find when they started refrigerating bodies in that part of the country. I didn't find exact dates, but in the early 1900s, I know this is in the late 1800s, but in the early 1800s, apart from using embalming fluids, post-mortem preservation was also done by soaking bodies in arsenic or alcohol. So you were like pickled, basically. I even came across a story about a body preserved in a barrel of whiskey until they could be properly buried, which is horrible, but it was unclear if refrigeration technology, even if it was used at the time of Octavia's death, was good enough to efficiently contend with like a hot Kentucky spring. She was buried very quickly in the family plot. According to legend, shortly after her tragic death, other mysterious and similar coma-like illnesses began to occur around town that were attributed to a kind of African mosquito. An illness where the coma-like state of a victim was so deep that it appeared as though they were dead, only to revive out of that state soon after, but not too soon after, like days after. Upon hearing this, as the story goes, James Hatcher became worried that his wife may have had the same illness and was perhaps buried alive, that he had her coffin exhumed, and to his sheer terror, this is awful, they discovered her fingers had been ripped apart, fingernails removed, and stuck inside the coffin lid from scratching, and her face was frozen in a tortured, horrified expression. It is said that out of complete despair and unfathomable guilt, he had a statue of her created to stand atop the grave, and indeed there is a quite beautiful statue there of her. It is real. I found a quote about the statue in the Courier Journal, which was actually an interview article with James Hatcher himself. It said, James Hatcher speaks of his wife as though her death were an event of yesterday. But high on a hill, overlooking the city where he lives, the statue of his wife stands, life-size and holding an umbrella, with a tiny effigy of their child at her feet. James Hatcher sent off to Italy and ordered a statue of his wife. He supplied the sculptor with a photograph and with a set of exact measurements as written down in the books belonging to Mrs. Hatcher's dressmaker. And with these facts before him, the sculptor created a statue as nearly like Octavia Smith Hatcher as possible. James Hatcher was pleased. He thought that he would place it in the front yard of his home, but later decided that the statue belonged on the grave of his departed wife on a hill above Pikeville. End quote. This doesn't sound to me that out of overwhelming despair and guilt he had the statue created. It just sounds like he loved her. There are a number of accounts of this story that you'll find all over the internet that say she was holding a baby, and that was destroyed by vandalism years later. But the only baby mentioned in regard to this statue was the effigy placed at the statue's feet. And truly, looking at the statue now and like the position of her arm, she would have been holding the baby like a handbag if it were ever there. So clearly that's just not true. In fact, there are many inconsistent details and big claims in this story, as it's commonly told anyway, that are not mentioned anywhere in any trustworthy publications. As a matter of fact, you can't even find her or her child's obituary. The newspaper of the time that would have had that information is simply lost to time. When you start to research this woman's life and death through forums, blogs, and historical reports, there's one resource that I noticed straight away was missing. For what could only be described as a very significant story about the death of a very wealthy and successful man's wife in Kentucky, Wikipedia has nothing on this. It doesn't even have a page that says this story even exists, not even as a legend. But that's the thing about Wikipedia. If you want to submit an article, you also have to submit the sources, and there are none at all. No newspaper articles, no quotes from James Hatcher, not even a relative statement. When you read about her story, there are people's names who allegedly did this research confirming that she was buried alive, but no one with any historical account of her and her death list where they got their information. I contacted the Big Sandy Heritage Center Museum. That's like a heritage museum for Pike County and the surrounding area. And I got a response from the museum director, who also happened to be a relative of James Hatcher, which was amazing. They said the museum has no evidence that Mrs. Hatcher was buried alive or exhumed, and they didn't recall a single story from family members confirming Octavia's exhumed body. And they said, quote, "As far as finding no newspaper articles concerning Octavia, I believe at that time, if James Hatcher had not wanted any newspaper articles, there would have been none." And that makes a lot of sense to me. He was a very successful man who surely had the resources to keep a harrowing situation like this private. But rather than thinking about this in terms of like a cover-up, it says more to me about the complete lack of evidence people are using to prove this story was real. There is nothing out there. So did this actually happen? We don't know and have no way to know. But how does a story like this just happen? And what was the most likely reason for Octavia's death? Here are a few common theories, and one of my own. Remember that safety coffin that James had displayed in his hotel? While sifting through urban legends and retellings of this story, some imply that out of fear of suffering his wife's gruesome fate, he had the coffin created for himself, although, like many other details, there is no proof of this. It was probably considered pretty wild that he'd display something so bizarre in a lobby of his hotel, something that would require some backstory from employees for creeped out hotel guests. After all, it's a hell of a conversation piece. And considering the legitimate mystery surrounding his wife's actual death, again, they didn't know what the actual cause was, and we do have proof of that. The fact that she had died a whole 30 to 40 years before this hotel was even opened, by the way, this was opened in like the 1930s. After rumors and theories had plenty of time to percolate, one can see how a creative picture can begin to be painted and like scuttlebutted around. Also, James Hatcher was apparently a big history buff, especially of the county and the surrounding towns. He had a particular love of Ivy Creek and the history behind the Battle of Ivy Narrows. He would tell bright, animated stories about the history there to friends and guests at the hotel. In an article written by Henry P. Scalf in the Floyd County Times, it's a 1956 article called Early Families of Eastern and Southeastern Kentucky. The author lists one of James Hatcher's favorite stories, and it's pretty creepy. It reads like this, quote, "If you had traveled up the valley with James, he would have pointed out the Drappin Lick, where early settlers lay in wait for deer to come down and lick the mineral waters. Farther up the road, he would stop beside a huge stone that decades ago had rolled down the mountainside and plopped itself in the middle of a bottom. You would listen to the legend he told. Years ago, so long ago no one now living remembers when, a woman with a babe in arms was walking along this road. It was late in the evening, when the shadows were falling across the leafy trail. She was seen by someone, nobody remembers whom. When she was midway across the bottom, there was a roar from the mountainside, and a giant rock came crashing downhill. Suddenly there was a long, piercing scream, and after that silence filled the twilight. People say today that the woman and her baby are buried under the giant stone. Some say that even today, on certain evenings, a woman draped in black can be seen walking around the eternal rock, looking for her child. Others say that each year on the anniversary of her death, screams can be heard. The Battle of Ivy Narrows is history, and the story of the rock is legend. Jim Hatcher loved both. According to that article from the Courier Journal, and this is a quote, "No one can tell a story any better than Colonel Hatcher, and one reason why the colonel ranks so high as a teller of yarns is surely the delight he takes himself in a good story." And this story of the young mother killed by a rock holding her baby is a story he no doubt told many other folks, and the crossover of the tragic death of a young mother that he loved to tell with the story of his own wife could possibly have been a seed that grew into the even more horrific legend of his wife that other people would come to tell. But I can't take credit for this theory. An author and historian named Jamie Rubio first connected these dots. I just ended up falling deeper down the rabbit holes after reading her work. Before we get to the spooky ghost stories involving Octavia, because of course there are many, I just want to talk about the mystery surrounding the illness that led to her death. The first one, the only one we know that actually happened. There simply is no way to know how she actually died. Her death was ruled unexplained by doctors at the time, and there's no documentation on any post-mortem tests. It's likely none were done at all. Again, there isn't even an obituary for her, or her baby, by the way, that can be found. All we know is that she was buried quickly, so we can't know. But I did do some digging into the Census of American Diseases in 1890. I didn't even know this data existed. It's fascinating. At the time, germ theory was new, wacky stuff, and most illnesses were thought to be caused by only two things, apart from the obvious, like getting your head cut off. One of those things was inflammation. In other words, like bad blood. This is why like bloodletting lasted as a treatment, in quotes, for so long and was still practiced at this time. So illnesses were caused by bad blood, or the cause was putrid, meaning there was a rot, like a morbific, acrid matter, like a decay in the system. Delicious. At this time, there was no washing hands, no sterilizing instruments, no appropriate cleaning before or after birth, other than like soap and water, which again probably wasn't even done before the baby was delivered. They just went for it. And so it is not a coincidence that apart from women dying of blood loss, high blood pressure, and all manner of complications, infection after birth was at the top of the list of actual causes. But they didn't specifically understand that yet. They didn't know that bacteria caused the death. They just thought it was childbirth itself. On the list of common diseases that caused death in the disease census of that time, childbirth was on that list, along with scarlet fever, croup, enteric fever, which is typhoid, malaria, tuberculosis, dropsy, which is edema, like swelling under the skin, diarrhea disorders, heart disease, and diphtheria. And listed among these is childbirth, along with stillbirth. Considering and treating pregnancy as an illness persists to this day, by the way. It's only until recently pregnancy was listed as a pre-existing condition. But that's all part of another kind of horror in America, as we're all familiar with here. But that is for another kind of horror podcast. Although the rumor at the time was that she was bitten by a mosquito, and malaria was actually something that occurred in Kentucky at that time, it's far more likely that, considering how quickly she became gravely ill after delivering the child, it was likely an infection related to that tragic event, and perhaps in conjunction with any number of horrible illnesses of the time, making it difficult to pinpoint exactly what the cause was. So that's my 2 cents, at least, about the mysteriousness of her specific symptoms and death. So as promised, let's get to the ghost stories. Over time, the story of Octavia's alleged live burial began to circulate around local counties. Teenagers would visit her grave on Halloween night and scare the heck out of each other. They claim the statue comes to life on certain nights and scares away people who come to disturb her grave. It's true that her statue was sadly vandalized and her arm was lost. Again, some say it was the arm holding a baby, but this was not true. However, the breaking of the arm triggered stories of a more vengeful Octavia in spirit form. It became said that on the night of her death's anniversary, the statue was seen to turn her back on the town because of her anger toward the people who buried her alive. And this was actually believed for a long time. Why did the arm being removed trigger this story? Because not long after, it was discovered that her statue was just being further vandalized by college students, and someone just turned her statue on its pedestal. This poor woman. So, some folks who live in the area swear they hear wailing and crying and see foggy incarnations close to her grave. There are few accounts of people hearing crying, specifically coming from the Hatcher plot, that stops as they get closer. And who am I to doubt them? It's also important to note that many people in Pikeville, Kentucky, despite any real evidence that this happened, truly believe that it did. They admit that there is no actual evidence, but swear there's enough anecdotal evidence that it did. But again, remains to be seen. One thing is for certain. It's quite likely that poor Octavia was not buried alive. But the sheer facts of her death, in my opinion, are just as horrific. This woman died slowly. 3 months is a long time to die. And after seeing her own child die, and then a truly horrible myth was made up about her, I would love to know anything about the actual woman that was Octavia Hatcher that is true, other than the names of her parents, where she was born, who she married, and how she died. Again, this info is not easy to find. I have looked and I cannot find it. If you're a relative or know a relative who has any more insight into her actual life, I would love to know and share it with you guys. And after everything she's been through and all the lies about her, it would be nice to bring some more truth to her story if I can. So please email myvictoriannightmare@gmail.com if you've got any info at all. Well, that was really awful. It was really awful. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry to have told you all the things that I told you on my podcast. I hope you're okay and that you will join me next week for more terrible information. Be kind to yourselves, and I'll see you in your nightmares.